Chapter 5. My vision of the scene came abruptly as I emerged from the forest. I found myself on the edge of a large clear space. On one side of this space rose up high bluffs. On the other side was the river. The earth bank ran steeply down to the water, but here and there, in several places, where at some time slides of earth had occurred, there were runways. These were the drinking places of the folk that lived in the caves, and this was the main abiding place of the folk that I had chanced upon. This was, I may say by stretching the word, the village. My mother and the chatterer and I, and a few other simple bodies, were what might be termed suburban residents. We were part of the horde, though we lived a distance away from it. It was only a short distance, though it had taken me what of my wandering all of a week to arrive. Had I come directly, I could have covered the trip in an hour. But to return. From the edge of the forest, I saw the caves in the bluff, the open space, and the runways to the drinking places. And in the open space I saw many of the folk. I had been straying alone and a child for a week. During that time I had seen not one of my kind. I had lived in terror and desolation. And now at the sight of my kind I was overcome with gladness, and I ran wildly toward them. Then it was that a strange thing happened. Some one of the folk saw me and uttered a warning cry. On the instant, crying out with fear and panic, the folk fled away. Leaping and scrambling over the rocks, they plunged into the mouths of the caves and disappeared. All but one, a little baby that had been dropped in the excitement close to the base of the bluff. He was wailing dolefully. His mother dashed out. He sprang to meet her and held on tightly as she scrambled back into the cave. I was all alone. The populous open space had of a sudden become deserted. I sat down forlornly and whimpered. I could not understand. Why had the folk run away from me in later time when I came to know their ways I was to learn? When they saw me dashing out of the forest at top speed, they concluded that I was being pursued by some hunting animal. By my unceremonious approach I had stampeded them. As I sat and watched the cave mouths, I became aware that the folk were watching me. Soon they were thrusting their heads out. A little later they were calling back and forth to one another. In the hurry and confusion, it had happened that all had not gained their own caves. Some of the young ones had sought refuge in other caves. The mothers did not call for them by name, because that was an invention we had not yet made. All were nameless. The mothers uttered querulous, anxious cries, which were recognized by the young ones. Thus had my mother been there calling to me, I should have recognized her voice amongst the voices of 1,000 mothers, and in the same way would she have recognized mine amongst 1,000. This calling back and forth continued for some time, but they were too cautious to come out of their caves and descend to the ground. Finally, one did come. He was destined to play a large part in my life, and for that matter, he already played a large part in the lives of all the members of the horde. He it was whom I shall call Red Eye in the pages of this history, so called because of his inflamed eyes, the lids being always red, and, by the peculiar effect they produced, seeming to advertise the terrible savagery of him. The color of his soul was red. He was a monster in all ways. Physically, he was a giant. He must have weighed 170 pounds. He was the largest one of our kind I ever saw. Nor did I ever see one of the fire people so large as he, nor one of the tree people. Sometimes, when in the newspapers I happen upon descriptions of our modern bruisers and prize fighters, I wonder what chance the best of them would have had against him. I am afraid not much of a chance. With one grip of his iron fingers and a pull, he could have plucked a muscle, say a biceps, by the roots, clear out of their bodies. A back-handed, loose blow of his fist could have smashed their skulls like egg-shells. With a sweep of his wicked feet or hind hands he could have disemboweled them. A twist could have broken their necks, and I know that with a single crunch of his jaws he could have pierced, at the same moment, the great vein of the throat in front and the spinal marrow at the back. He could spring 20 feet horizontally from a sitting position. He was abominably hairy. It was a matter of pride with us to be not very hairy. But he was covered with hair all over, on the inside of the arms as well as the outside, and even the ears themselves. The only places on him where the hair did not grow were the soles of his hands and feet, and beneath his eyes. He was frightfully ugly, his ferocious grinning mouth and huge down hanging under lip being but in harmony with his terrible eyes. This was Red Eye. And right gingerly he crept out of his cave and descended to the ground. Ignoring me, he proceeded to reconnoiter. He bent forward from the hips as he walked, and so far forward did he bend, and so long were his arms, that with every step he touched the knuckles of his hands to the ground on either side of him. He was awkward in the semi-erect position of walking that he assumed, and he really touched his knuckles to the ground in order to balance himself. But oh, I tell you, he could run on all fours. Now this was something at which we were particularly awkward. Furthermore, it was a rare individual among us who balanced himself with his knuckles when walking. Such an individual was an atavism, and Red Eye was an even greater atavism. That is what he was, an atavism. We were in the process of changing our tree life to life on the ground. For many generations we had been going through this change, and our bodies and carriage had likewise changed. But Red Eye had reverted to the more primitive tree-dwelling type. Perforce, because he was born in our horde, he stayed with us, but in actuality he was an atavism, and his place was elsewhere. Very circumspect and very alert, he moved here and there about the open space, peering through the vistas among the trees and trying to catch a glimpse of the hunting animal that all suspected had pursued me. And while he did this, taking no notice of me, the folk crowded at the cave mouths and watched. At last he evidently decided that there was no danger lurking about. He was returning from the head of the runway, from where he had taken a peep down at the drinking place. His course brought him near, but still he did not notice me. He proceeded casually on his way until abreast of me, and then, without warning and with incredible swiftness, he smote me a buffet on the head. I was knocked backward fully a dozen feet before I fetched up against the ground, and I remember, half stunned, even as the blow was struck, hearing the wild uproar of clucking and shrieking laughter that arose from the caves. It was a great joke, at least in that day, and right heartily the folk appreciated it. Thus was I received into the horde. Red Eye paid no further attention to me, and I was at liberty to whimper and sob to my heart's content. Several of the women gathered curiously about me, and I recognized them. I had encountered them the preceding year when my mother had taken me to the hazelnut canyons, but they quickly left me alone, being replaced by a dozen curious and teasing youngsters. They formed a circle around me, pointing their fingers, making faces, and poking and pinching me. I was frightened, and for a time I endured them. Then anger got the best of me, and I sprang tooth and nail upon the most audacious one of them, none other than Lop Ear himself. I have so named him because he could prick up only one of his ears. The other ear always hung limp and without movement. Some accident had injured the muscles and deprived him of the use of it. He closed with me, and we went at it for all the world like a couple of small boys fighting. We scratched and bit, pulled hair, clinched, and threw each other down. I remember I succeeded in getting on him what in my college days I learned was called a half Nelson. This hold gave me the decided advantage, but I did not enjoy it long. He twisted up one leg, and with the foot or hind hand made so savage an onslaught upon my abdomen as to threaten to disembowel me. I had to release him in order to save myself, and then we went at it again. Lop Ear was a year older than I, but I was several times angrier than he, and in the end he took to his heels. I chased him across the open and down a run way to the river, but he was better acquainted with the locality, and ran along the edge of the water and up another run way. He cut diagonally across the open space and dashed into a wide-mouthed cave. Before I knew it, I had plunged after him into the darkness. The next moment I was badly frightened. I had never been in a cave before. I began to whimper and cry out. Lop Ear chattered mockingly at me, and, springing upon me unseen, tumbled me over. He did not risk a second encounter, however, and took himself off. I was between him and the entrance, and he did not pass me, yet he seemed to have gone away. I listened, but could get no clue as to where he was. This puzzled me, and when I regained the outside I sat down to watch. He never came out of the entrance of that, I was certain, yet at the end of several minutes he chuckled at my elbow again. I ran after him, and again he ran into the cave, but this time I stopped at the mouth. I dropped back a short distance and watched. He did not come out yet. As before, he chuckled at my elbow, and was chased by me a third time into the caveth. His performance was repeated several times. Then I followed him into the cave, where I searched vainly for him. I was curious. I could not understand how he eluded me. Always he went into the cave, never did he come out of it, yet always did he arrive there at my elbow and mock me. Thus did our fight transform itself into a game of hide and seek all afternoon. With occasional intervals we kept it up, and a playful, friendly spirit arose between us. In the end he did not run away from me, and we sat together with our arms around each other. A little later he disclosed the mystery of the wide-mouthed cave. Holding me by the hand, he led me inside it, connected by a narrow crevice with another cave, and it was through this that we regained the open air. We were now good friends. When the other young ones gathered around to tease, he joined with me in attacking them, and so viciously did we behave that before long I was let alone. Lop Ear made me acquainted with the village. There was little that he could tell me of conditions and customs. He had not the necessary vocabulary, but by observing his actions I learned much, and also he showed me places and things, took me up the open space between the caves and the river, and into the forest beyond, where, in a grassy place among the trees, we made a meal of stringy rooted carrots. After that we had a good drink at the river, and started up the runway to the caves. It was in the runway that we came upon Red Eye again. The first I knew, Lop Ear had shrunk away to one side, and was crouching low against the bank. Naturally and involuntarily I imitated him. Then it was that I looked to see the cause of his fear. It was Red Eye, swaggering down the center of the runway and scowling fiercely with his inflamed eyes. I noticed that all the youngsters shrank away from him, as we had done, while the grown-ups regarded him with wary eyes when he drew near, and stepped aside to give him the center of the path. As twilight came on, open space was deserted. The folk were seeking the safety of the caves. Lop Ear led the way to bed high up the bluff. We climbed higher than all the other caves, to a tiny crevice that could not be seen from the ground. Into this Lop Ear squeezed. I followed with difficulty, so narrow was the entrance, and found myself in a small rock chamber. It was very low, not more than a couple of feet in height, and possibly 3 feet by 4 in width and length. Here, cuddled together in each other's arms, we slept out the night.